Working for Eclipse Source, and I'm going to introduce today EMF Forms, which is a framework to build business UIs. What is the problem that we're looking at or trying to solve with that framework? In many applications you have data that is being viewed or edited in a form-based UI. So what you basically have is you have a data model. In my case this is a user, and the user has a number of properties such as a first name, which is a string, so each property has a type as well. It has a last name, which is also a string, but other properties with different types. And what you want to do, like active, which is a Boolean, or an enumeration, which is, for example, nationality or date. And what you want to do is you want to map that to a UI. So the idea is that the first name from an instance of that class is being displayed in an appropriate field, should have a label. The field should support the respective type. So in this case, it's a text field. In this case, it should be a number field. If it's a date, that depends on whether you have a date with a time or not, then it looks different, or it is a drop-down in the case of an enumeration. So basically what you do is you map the properties from your, what I call a domain model, onto the UI. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the same order, of course. There could be different layouts. Some of the properties might not be mapped because you don't want to see them in the form. But that's the essential step. You pick properties from your domain model and you put them on a form and you display that on the form. By the way, how many of you are familiar with EMF or have worked with EMF? Yeah, it's almost everyone. So if you're not familiar with EMF, in a nutshell, EMF is a framework to model your data with something like a UML class diagram, and then to derive Java classes from that implement what you've modeled as classes. So what you could, of course, do is just go ahead and manually code those forms. And then you basically start to code a form for every entity that you have in your model, and that might just be a huge effort. And the form sounds maybe simple in the beginning, but then you get into other problems because maybe some fields should only be visible. If another field has a certain value, you want to have validation, you will show validation markers, all these sorts of things. So it is a huge coding effort in the end. And the idea of EMF Forms is you don't only model your domain model with EMF so that you have your eCore EMF model, but you also model your UI. So apart from the domain model, which is an eCore, can also be imported from an XSD if you have that. Apart from that, we also define something that is called a view model. And I will go into details what it exactly is. But the idea of the view model is it defines how the data is being displayed in a form. And what you get from that is, or supposed to get from that, is a user interface. And that is being done by a renderer. So the renderer is the component that kind of interprets the domain model plus the view model for a given entity. So maybe the domain model for the user with the given properties, and a view model that describes how that properties map onto a form-based UI, and doing that also for a specific UI technology. So maybe it's an SWT render in this case, and it produces that form in SWT. Now, if we look into that in detail, the first thing that the view model does is something like data binding. So data binding in this view model is done with controls. So we have a control here, and the control is exactly what you can see in the red box here. So it's the label and the text input box. So it's that thing that displays the first name and allows to edit the first name. And it's a data binding because that control is bound to a property from the domain model. So what you do in the view model is to say, I want a control at this location in the UI, and I want it to bind to the first name of the user. So whenever there's an instance of the user I display the form for, this field will display the first name property of that user object. So that's data binding with controls. And the second thing you will need is to be able to model some structure. And we do that with layouts. You can see that on this side we have a 2-column layout. How you do that is you define a horizontal layout. A horizontal layout places things one beside another. In our case, it's two things. It's one vertical layout for the left column and another vertical layout for the right column. And the vertical layout works exactly the opposite way. It places things one below another. So by using those very simple constructs, you can easily have this two-column layout. And these are the two essential ingredients to UI modeling with EMF Forms. You have layouts and you have the controls. And I'm going to show you that directly in the tool. So this is Mars modeling package with the latest EMF Forms version. And what it comes with, you can also follow that in the website if you want to do it after the presentation. There is a very good getting started tutorial, and everything is based on examples that ship with the EMF Form installation. So I'm going to use just those. If I look into the examples, I just start with using an example model, so I don't even have to create a model, and install that into my IDE. And just have a look at the model. It's the model that we've already been talking about. So this is the eCore, and the eCore contains only very few classes. It's a basic model for managing tasks. We have a task, we have a user and a user group. I'm only going to look into details for the user because I'm going to use that entity for the remainder of my presentation. And this entity has exactly the properties that we've been looking at. So it has a first name, which is a string, the weight, which is a double, nationality, which is an enumeration, and so on. So this is our domain model that we are using here. What I've done already is the usual thing you do with EMF. I've created a gen model. I've generated the code from that. That is why I have two plugins. I have the model plugin with the generated code in the source folder, and the edit plugin for helping with displaying those models. So essentially that contains icons, labels, and the definition of a hierarchy for my model. But that's all generated. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I want to create a view model. And you do that with EMF Forms by selecting the eCore you want to create the view model for, and selecting EMF Forms, and then create view model project. You can also only create a view model if you already have a project, but I want an entire project to be created. I'll just pick the default name. You can now also let EMF Forms generate the entire view model for you. It will just choose a default view model. That is, it will just put every property in a vertical layout, one after another. So you have a simple form already without doing anything. But I won't do that, just to get you started from scratch. And I have to select the E-class I want to create the view model for. I want a view model for a user. So now I have the view model here in my view model editor. And in the view model, as we discussed, the first thing we need is controls to bind against the domain model. I can create controls here. Now I have a control, and the control, as we discussed, binds with what we call domain model reference to a certain property in the domain model. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, it's good enough to just know the feature path domain model reference. A feature in EMF speak is a property, and a feature path is you can even navigate through multiple properties down to the specific property that you want to display. In our case, the feature path is only length 1 because we select exactly one property from the user. There is other domain model references that can do more complicated things, but that doesn't really matter for now. So I choose a feature path domain model reference, and now I can select the actual feature. And these are all the features that are in the user. So I'm just going to select the first name of the user and bind that. You can also give the controller name. That's really only a label within the view model editor. And now I have a control that is bound to the first name of the user. And I can even look at how that would potentially look like. There is a preview that I can open up, and it doesn't look very spectacular. It's only this one control with the appropriate label. But it's functional, so you could type in here something and actually there is an E object instantiated in the background and the data binding is already running. So there is an object now in memory of type user that has a first name set to that string. Okay, so I could continue to do that, create another control, bind it to a domain model reference. Now select the last name, maybe give it a name here as well. Update my preview, next thing. Now you can already see something else. The last name, if we look into the task eCore, the last name is not an optional property. You need to have a last name. And that's already something you get for free because you need to have a last name that was detected by EMF Forms. It added the little star to the field to indicate that to the user, and also now it shows a validation error because it can't be unset, this feature. And if I enter something here, then that's fine again. Okay. Normally you won't do that like I do just now, add everything manually. So either you can have all the controls created with the wizard we had in the beginning, or you can just go ahead and use an action in here, which is called generate controls. And now I can just generate controls for all of the remaining attributes in this case. So all the currently unbound attributes, I just select them all, finish. Now I have a quite decent view model. It contains now the controls for everything that was in the user. And I can, of course, also update the preview. And you can see that now there's a bunch of new controls. There's a table-like control even because that's a multi-valued property down here. Okay, so that is controls, data binding with controls. Now we need some structure. We want exactly the same layout that we've seen before. So I'm going to add a layout. I'm going to add a horizontal layout. And in the horizontal layout, I'm going to put two columns, that is two vertical layouts, 1 and 2. To make them easily identifiable, I'll give them names. That's the left column. That's the right column. And then I can just drag things in however I like to do that. So I'll add all those controls in the left column and all those controls in the right column. And if we bring up the preview again, you can also set that to auto refresh. And we see that now we have a 2-column layout. Okay, so everything we've did so far was just in the IDE, but how does that actually play with my application? How do I now use those forms that I've created within my actual application? To get an example for that, there's also ships with the SDK. I'll start with an E3 application and just let it create that. I have a very simple E3 application here. And if we look at that, it has one view. And if you look into the code of the view, this is code to set up an SWT composite, some code to do some layouting and background. And this is the actual code that goes to the EMF Forms framework. It creates a view model context that defines which object is to be displayed and which view model is to be used, and then it calls to the ECP SWT view renderer. That is a renderer for SWT. We come to that later. There's also renderers for different UI technologies, but for this example I'm sticking to SWT, and it just calls render, and the render method gets a composite, and that is the composite where it should render the form onto. So wherever in your application for SWT now you have a composite, you can let EMF Forms render a form that you have specified onto that composite, and that's it. You pass in the E object and the composite, and you get the form for that specific E object. And whenever something is changed in the UI, so somebody types something in one of the input fields of the form, that is data bound against the E object that you have passed in. So when the form is left, or when you close your wizard, or wherever the form was on, you have the data captured in the E object, and you can continue with your normal application workflow. I can launch that, of course. There is in the generated plugin, there is a product configuration, and you can just launch that. And it launches a very simple application with only one view, displaying that exact form that we have specified. And it's functional, so if I type something in here, the validation will work, and I can select stuff like a date, and so on. I think this one is also, yeah. And some of the things are validations that just make something red but still allow an input. Other validations, like entering numbers here, are preemptive, so they will just not allow you to do that. Okay, that's the E3 application. Now, you can do exactly the same thing for E4, of course. It also works with that. So, just for the example, generate also an E4 application. Looks very similar. Also has the same code, but this time in a sample part. There's no views anymore in E4. And the sample part does exactly the same. Sets up a composite, sets up a view model context, and triggers the rendering onto the composite that we've just created. And does some very sophisticated error handling down here. Okay, and I can, of course, also launch that. And I get the same application, but this time it's a native E4 application. Okay, so that's all good, but is it really enough in terms of view model elements, what you have here? If we go back to the view model editor, I mean, there's a bunch of different view model element types, but that looks rather basic. And the idea of EMF Forms is that we provide a number of basic controls and basic elements of a form-based UI. But the reality is that I would say our users typically, for their application, they can use 95% of those. But there's another 5% of, I would call them, quite strange or quite specific elements that only that specific customer needs. And therefore, EMF Forms is very extensible. It is extensible in two ways there. The first one is you can easily just replace a renderer. So let's say you don't like how a number control is being rendered, or how it behaves, or you don't like how a group that I will show in a minute behaves. You can just replace the renderer. It means that you still have the same elements here in the view model editor, but you have a different renderer and it just displays it differently. The other, more radical way is you can also say, okay, I need an entirely new element. Let's say that this doesn't support groups and you want groups. You can add new elements into the view model and then define a renderer for that. And I'm just going to give an example for that. So another model from here. So this is the first example is about being able to replace the renderer for existing things. What I want to do in my case is we had one field which was an email field. It's of type string, so therefore the string control renderer is responsible for rendering that. And it doesn't take care if this is really an email address, and also I don't have a send button or anything like that to actually trigger an email action from that. So if I wanted to do that, I can add a renderer to EMF Forms. And I can do that by defining an OSGI service. It's a declarative service, and it's a renderer service. And if we look at the class, it's actually pretty simple. It needs to implement a method whether this renderer is applicable for a given view model element. So that can be a control, for example, and for a given view model context. And what this code here does is it checks whether the given view model element is actually a control, because I only want to do something if it is a control. And then, in a fairly complicated manner, I have to admit, it needs to find out whether this control is exactly about the user's email address. It's a bit artificial in this case. You could also check for whether it looks like an email address and an @ is contained or something like that. But only if it is the user's email address, then I declare myself responsible with an arbitrary priority of 10. So you can have even different additional renders that you add at different priorities, and the highest priority will win. Or in case this is not exactly the user's email attribute, I'm just going to call not applicable, and then I'm not being responsible for rendering that. If I get called to render that, I can give back a class that actually implements the renderer. And if we look into that class, it extends the existing text control renderer. And this is the actual implementation of what the rendering does. It creates a composite and then places the button and the control itself and adds a listener to the button to open up mail whenever I click the button. So it's fairly simple. And most of the controls are actually fairly simple in their implementation. OK, now what I need to do is I need to add that to the run configuration. I'm just going to use the E3 application and add this additional renderer so that it becomes active. Now I have an additional renderer registered, and for the email control, it will get used. It will not get used for last name or first name because they don't match the attribute. And if I type something in here, it'll bring up, on the button press, it'll bring up my email application. So this way you can replace any existing behavior of something that is in there, how it's being rendered. The other way is adding new elements. For that, we just assume that groups didn't exist at this point in time. So I'm going to add another plugin for groups. And they basically define a renderer how groups are being rendered in a very different way. And they also define how groups actually look like. And if I add a group to that at some point, like here, and drag a couple of controls into the group, this is how it usually would look like. You can see it in the preview now. There's a border around that. I haven't given the group a name. Maybe I should do that. And now you can see it's actually an SWT group. And if I now make the new plugin also active, the group will render differently. Now we have the group displayed as an expand bar. And you can do that for virtually any element in there. OK, so what we've already looked at during the demo is we have looked at how you actually embed stuff. What you essentially do is you call to the renderer of the specific UI technology, in our case SWT, and you pass in a composite, an SWT composite, and a domain object to be rendered. EMF Forms is then going to find out which view model is responsible for that. In fact, even if you didn't register a view model or didn't create a view model, it's just going to create one for you on the fly. So it works out of the box even if you didn't use the IDE tooling to create something. And if you didn't create something, it's just going to create what I told you before. So it's just a vertical layout with every property one after another. But often enough, that's a good starting point. And by that call only, you can embed it into, I don't know, your wizard or your preferences or your view, wherever you want this form to be displayed. We also briefly talked about other features. What I've shown you is how you can use controls to edit data and layouts to structure UI. You've seen part of the IDE tooling. And there's additional view model elements for other layouts that you can additionally install with features that also come with EMF Forms. There's the live validation that we've seen. This validation is not proprietary to EMF Forms. It's in fact the default EMF validation. So whenever you register a validation rule for EMF, it gets picked up and it's being displayed on the appropriate control. There is a mechanism for rule-based visibility. So the idea is Let's say you have an enumeration dropdown, you select a certain value. Only if you have a certain value in there, other parts of the UI get enabled or get even visible. And that is something we only touched a little bit, is basically the UI technology gets exchangeable by that, because you extract your form from the forms for your UI from the UI technology into a declarative format that is the EMF Forms view model. And that's also a reality right now in part. So you have an SWT renderer that ships with EMF Forms that is production ready. There is a development branch of a JavaFX renderer. So you can take the same view model but let it render with JavaFX. There's a production ready renderer for the browser that is based on RAP, the remote application platform. There is in development currently a renderer based on AngularJS, so that you can render the same forms, but in this case within an AngularJS application. And there's a demo of a mobile-based renderer based on Tabris. These are just screenshots of the different rendering technologies. The one on the left is SWT, JavaFX, this is the AngularJS-based one, and this is an iOS Tabris-based one renderer. Every time of the same form, essentially. So obviously this is great technology, but when should you really use it? A good indication when to use it is if you have a large domain model, if you have many different entities that you need forms for, then it really makes sense to do it because you can save a lot of code. If you have many different views, obviously, it could happen that your domain model is not so large, but for the same entity you have 3, 5, 10 different forms, maybe based on different user roles, for example. If you have frequent domain model changes, that's also interesting, because if your domain model changes, it's very simple to add an additional control. And you even have validation that a specific property is no longer available in your domain model, so it can't bind anymore, or if there's additional properties. You get a pretty homogeneous UI. People would maybe also say what you can't do is do a perfect layout everywhere, because you have those renderers and they render the same thing every time the same way. But it gives you a very homogeneous UI, and if you want to change something like the date picker should behave differently, or we don't like that date picker that we currently have, it's very simple to just application-wide change that behavior by plugging in another renderer for date control, and you change the behavior everywhere. You get a certain independence of a UI technology. It makes it easier to support two technologies at once, or to even add or switch to another technology. And that is more a practical thing that I discovered. You can also improve your customer involvement a lot, because you can very easily come up with an application that looks fairly functional without you having defined any forms, because you just let it render a form for every e-object you have. And then you can iteratively start to revise those forms. It usually leads to a much faster turnaround, and you can do rapid prototyping to get the customer on board. And many of the UI concepts are actually fairly easy to grasp. So technical users like engineers I've seen, they can also define the forms themselves after some time. The next release is the 1.7 release for Mars SR1. We are planning on having a lot of API, SPI improvements. It's essentially adding more API and SPI. We've been quite restrictive with what's out there at the moment. We are going to add specific eCore edit support, so that if your domain model references part from the eCore, that you have controls that allow you to edit that. So let's say your domain model references an E-class, that you can pick an E-class from the package registry and so on. And also we are working towards a new domain model reference API and also UI. As you've seen, we're not so happy with you having to select this feature path domain model reference that you have to understand what it really is. And finally, most of the work will go into the web renderer based on AngularJS. It's actually even a separate project. It's called JSON Forms. It's an entirely JSON schema, HTML5, and AngularJS-based renderer. And there is an export bridge from EMF Forms to transform it into a JSON Forms model that can be displayed with that. So it will be fully compatible. If you want to get started with that, probably the best starting point is our webpage and the Getting Started tutorial. It does almost the same that I do in the presentation. It's fairly easy to follow. And there's, of course, the Twitter where we announce the new releases, features, and so on. And finally, please evaluate the session. This session. Thank you very much.